Hi, folks. What's happening? Um, Time to start getting into chapter three, section three. Hopefully, you've been learning a lot over the course of the semester so far, and um, we're now going to start using some of the concepts that we've discussed, and we're going to start bringing them into the context of race and ethnicity in the United States. So, when we're talking about the origins of slavery, we know that the first slaves to ever make it to the United States came in 1619 when a Dutch ship arrived. Uh, they needed provisions and they offered to trade 20 black Africans. We also know that England at this time, this was colonial England, they were not engaging in slavery, so it's safe to say that this transaction ended up placing these African slaves into indentured servitude status or possibly contract laborers. And once they satisfied the indentured servitude or the contract labor requirements, they became free citizens. The positions of African indentured servants in the colonies remained ambiguous for several decades, continuing the process of England not being involved in the slave trade. Um, and we do know that some indentured servitude black Africans became free citizens. But it wasn't until the 1660s that the first laws defining slavery were enacted. In the century, of course, that followed, hundreds of additional laws were passed. And by the 1750s, slavery had been clearly defined in law and in custom. This is colonial England, not America yet. Slavery was such a acceptable solution, especially to the labor supply problem that uh, colonial England and many of the colonies of many of the nations that were engaging in um, this empire building during this time. The business of the colony, of course, was agriculture, especially farm work. It was labor intensive, and up until this point, it was not industrialized yet. So this is almost entirely hand labor. We know that as colonial society grew more developed, the plantation system also became more defined. Plantation system comes out of um, specific forms of agricultural production, and of course, as we all know, lays the foundations for slave society in the United States. About the same time, the supply of white indentured servants from the British Isles began to dwindle. Um, these white indentured servants were not as valuable as slaves because an indentured servant had a contract, and once the contract was fulfilled, maybe that contract was 5 years, maybe that contract was 7 years, they were released, they were freed. Now, many of the indentured servitude contracts were written in such a way that hopefully, at least for those that held the contracts, the indentured servant would not be able to meet the criteria to be released from it. But the idea that the contract would end and then you would have to go out and get new indentured servants was a problem. as you can see here, the slave trade routes, especially those coming from the Gold Coast of Western Africa. They didn't just go to the United States. We talk about slavery in reference to the United States because we are in the United States, but the vast majority of slaves went to South America, in particular Brazil. They occupied many of the British Isles, the West Indies, where plantations were growing surplus crops for the market. And as you can see, these slaves went all over the world. We know that the white indentured servitude was not a viable solution to the labor supply problem. We also know that British colonists tried to use Native Americans. That didn't work, mostly because Native Americans could actually escape from their slave status, and they could retreat into the forests that they knew, and it was really hard to track them down. It was really hard to catch Native American slaves. Africans, on the other hand, did not know the lay of the land. They stuck out in ways that Native Americans did not stick out, and they become the most logical, cost-effective way to solve the labor supply problems. So the colonists created slavery to cultivate their lands and to generate profit, status, and success. In a society that demanded massive amounts of manual labor for profits to be accrued, slave status was just the most viable option. So when we think about the contact situation, or the conditions under which groups first come into contact, and how they determine the immediate fate of the minority group and shape intergroup relations for years to come, well, we think of the Noel hypothesis. And the Noel hypothesis states that if two or more groups come together in a contact situation characterized by ethnocentrism, one group thinking they're ethnically superior to the other, and a differential in power, then some form of racial or ethnic stratification is going to result. Ethnocentrism is the tendency to judge other groups, societies, or lifestyles by the standards of one's own culture. And of course, competition is a struggle over scarce commodities. These differentials in power between the groups, or the ability of a group to achieve its goals even in the face of opposition from other groups, is a function of three factors. First, the size of the group can make a difference. In all other things being equal, larger groups are more powerful. But it doesn't require a larger group. Second, in addition to raw numbers, the degree of organization, discipline, and the quality of group leadership can make a difference in the ability of a group to pursue its goals. So the more organized, the more disciplined, and the better leaders you have, the more likely you are to be able to exert your influence over another groups. And the third component of power is resources, anything that can be used to help the group achieve its goals. So the Noel hypothesis, when we think about how it works, Well, we see these three aspects: ethnocentrism, competition, and a differential in power. Through ethnocentrism, we see group boundaries being established. Through competition, we see a motivation to establish superiority. And then through a differential in power, we see how the dominant group imposes its will on the minority group. And ultimately, that results in what we know as ethnic or racial stratification. That's the Noel hypothesis. The Blauner hypothesis, on the other hand, identifies two different initial relationships, one being colonization and two being immigration. And Blauner hypothesizes that minority groups created by colonization will experience more intense prejudice, racism, and discrimination than those created by immigration. The disadvantaged status of colonized groups will persist longer and be more difficult to overcome than the disadvantaged status of groups using immigration. When Blauner talks about the colonized minority groups, he's talking about the groups that are forced into minority status by the superior military or political will of the dominating group. He talks about how they're subjected to massive inequalities and attacks on their cultures, how they are assigned to positions from which any form of assimilation is extremely difficult and perhaps even forbidden, and how they are identified by highly visible racial or physical characteristics that maintain and reinforce the oppressive system. These specific aspects are used to keep those colonized in their places, so they don't get out of line, they don't pose a threat to this new authority. Immigrant groups, on the other hand, are at least in part voluntary participants in the host society and have at least some control over their destination and their position in the host society. They're choosing to come here. Unlike those that have been colonized, they did not choose to have the colonizer arrive on their shores and use that military and political power to subject them to slave-like situations. These immigrant minority groups do not occupy such markedly inferior positions as colonized groups do, and they retain enough internal organization and resources to pursue their own self-interest. With immigrants, there's somewhat of a control over your destiny, unlike a colonized or a slave situation. And they commonly experience more rapid acceptance and easier movement to equality, as boundaries between groups are not so rigidly maintained, especially when the groups are racially similar. In other words, they can assimilate into society. Blauner talks about enclave and middleman minorities, which often originate as immigrant groups who bring some resources and thus have some opportunity, more opportunities than colonized minority groups to carve out places for themselves in the host society. They're also racially distinguishable, and certain kinds of opportunities may be closed to them. And combined characteristics of both the colonized and the immigrant minority group experience are common in these groups, which produce an intermediate status between the more assimilated white ethnic group and the colonized racial minorities. You can think of enclaves like Chinatown, the Jewish community had an enclave mentality in reference to their immigration. So we have examples of this in our society for sure.